For our cultural case study, my group chose the African American population. My name is Sydney Steffen.
I'm Ryan Felicia.
I'm Jessa Glenn.
I'm Gabe Montgomery.
And I'm Dylan Underwood.
Some demographics regarding the African American population. In the United States, as of 2017, there were 41.4 million African Americans. The African American population makes up 12% of the whole population. They are currently the second largest minority group. African Americans have 2.3 times the infant mortality rate compared to non-Hispanic whites. From the 1500s to around 1866, more than 12 million African American slaves were shipped across the world due to the transatlantic slave trade. Only 10.7 million of those slaves survived the Middle Passage. June 19th, 1865, which is also referred to Juneteenth, is the day of emancipation for those enslaved in the United States. Black History Month was created by Carter Woodson in 1962 to honor African American oppression and history. 58% of the African American population in the United States resides in the South as of 2017. From the map, you can clearly see that the African American population resides in the South. In 2017, Texas, Georgia, and Florida had the largest African American population. Between the 1990s and the 2000s, the West experienced the highest population growth.
Language, fluency, and communication styles. So this slide is basically going to go over politics, preaching, and influencing. So language can influence a wide range of things within pop culture, things like objects, people, and events. African American culture in general has been one of the most influential of those across our other races and ethnicities, especially on American culture itself. Their language is really originating from storytelling and songs to proverbs, all passed down to keep tradition during slavery times and pre-slavery times, and even used functionally like in the Underground Railroad and just with recipes. Really though, after slavery time, it changed from just a form of communication to more of something of a personal connection, and then more of an art form, as you'll see in the next slide. Huge movements and sightings of languages have really been centered around in the gospel, basically church choir, the I Have a Dream speech that we all know from Martin Luther King Jr., and then NWA, a huge hip hop group, rap group. This is going over jazz, hip hop, and just basically everyday language. Now, 84.7% of the Black population aged over 25 and over has had high school diploma or even higher. This means that they don't have a huge language barrier when it comes to healthcare, but it is still present in there. So jazz emerged out of many different types of music, such as slave songs, ragtime, and military band. As you see in the picture, this is Duke Ellington and his band in the 1930s. So this is a time that they were still, the African Americans were still very oppressed, but really they were needed in the workforce and everyday society. This is when they moved from southern cities more into urbanized northern cities where they were needed and working in factories and stuff like that. Now it was switched into hip hop, and this emerged a little bit more in the 70s and 80s, more as a positive, empowering voice for the working class African Americans at the time that they were struggling economically and dealing with the rise of a drug epidemic. You'll see in the video that we play in a little bit that really it was born out of more economical and social hardships. People were they were using it as a voice to kind of say to the rest of the population what they were going through and why they were saying things like that.
For religion, spirituality, and beliefs, historical Black Protestants is 94%, and that was out of a sample size of 97. Muslim was 28% out of a sample size of 232, and Jehovah's Witness was 27% for 242 as a sample size, and unaffiliated was 9%. This is just a closer look at where the Black Protestant tradition is and where it's mostly at. And as you can see, it is down in the South more. And with religion today, in recent years, the share of African Americans who identify as religious unaffiliated has increased. In about 2007, about 12% African Americans identified with this. Later in 2014, it went up about 18%. This change was mostly seen in the 18 to 29 year age gap, with 29% compared to 65 is over and is only 7%.
So as far as education attainment goes, an estimated 87.1% of African Americans were a high school graduate or higher. An estimated 22.5% had a bachelor's degree or higher. African Americans are more likely to attend high poverty schools than Caucasians. The overall curriculums are often less rigorous. There are less resources and lower expectations for students and teachers in the African American population than for their white counterparts.
For economics, African Americans, they experience way worse economic conditions compared to white people in the population as a whole. Black women face a double penalty in income, earning less due to both their gender and their racial disparities. In 2018, for every dollar that a white household made, African American households made 59 cents. Unemployment rates for African Americans is 50% higher than the rest of the population. Black Americans are also 2 times more likely to live in poverty as white Americans, and Black children are 3 times more likely to live in poverty as compared to white children. And this chart just goes from January of 1972 to January of 2020. And it basically just shows how Black unemployment has consistently almost doubled white unemployment across time. So for the past 50 something years. Insurance coverage varies between racial groups in the US. At all ages, African Americans have lower insurance rates compared to the white population. 55% of African Americans use private health insurance in 2017 compared to 75% of white Americans that used private health insurance in that same year. And almost 10% of African Americans were uninsured in 2017 compared to 5.9% of white Americans.
Traditional and native diet. So like we said on the geographical slide, the majority of African Americans in the US live in the South. So this is basically where soul food has been stemmed from and where it originates. Basically from the time of slavery, this kind of became their norm, as well as now just going through generation and generation. Initially, it was just used because that's really what the slave owners would give them, more like less desired cuts, as in pig's feet, tail, ribs, ears, livers, chitlins, and jowls, catfish, crawfish, other crustaceans. But now it's used as more of a coping mechanism and a remembrance of survival and perseverance through the toughest of times, slavery, oppression, and now the ongoing racism that African Americans are experiencing on a daily basis. Recipes and methods of cooking passed on from generation to generation, really bring families together at dinners, and Sunday dinners are a huge thing, or just really gatherings. So soul food, really, the problem is that it contains high fat content as well as very high sodium levels. But really, it was easier to find things, easier to afford now, and to prepare, less time to prepare. So common dishes include cornbread, grits, collard greens, fried chicken, sweet potatoes, and much more. Effects of soul food and how to possibly fix it. So women of African American descent have amongst the highest rates of obesity or being overweight in the US, basically 4 out of 5 women. This means that they're more likely to suffer from high blood pressure, hypertension, high levels of blood fats, diabetes, and LDL cholesterol, which in return will be higher rates of heart disease and stroke. Kind of ways to go about this is really take your time. Don't try and do everything all at the same time, and just little time changes at a time. I think this is a problem that we should address, knowing where soul food stems from. It's not only just a way of food, but it's a way of life, a way of remembering. So maybe just including more fruits and vegetables, more of the seafood, lean meats, poultry, eggs, beans, definitely unsalted nuts and seeds, fat-free, low-fat milk products, and whole grains. Definitely limiting beverages and foods with added sugars and high saturated fats, and most importantly, limiting the salt intake.
Some health conditions / issues with African Americans is that 2 of the leading causes of death for African Americans are heart disease and cancer. The average life expectancy is estimated to be 75.6 years for African Americans compared to 79 years for white people. African Americans also have higher rates of cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, and sexually transmitted diseases. And in this chart, it kind of just shows you all the different causes of death, and they're not in order, but at the bottom you can see that diseases of the heart causes one of the highest amount of deaths with 206 deaths. So.
Health beliefs, healing practices, cultural practices, etc. Before they came to America, they really were involved in the herbal cures, and over time they borrowed additional practices from the Native Americans. With their history, one can understand that when it came to healthcare, they really focused on survival.
So some cultural fun facts are, so as famous protesters go, most people know about Rosa Parks, but there was also Claudette Colvin, who was less known, and she was arrested 9 months before Rosa Parks for not giving up her bus seat.
Another fact is the first documented African American woman to serve in the U.S. Army. In 1866, Kathy Williams posed as a man in order to enlist. She was a house slave. Her owner died in the Civil War, but that did not grant her her freedom. She originally was taken so she would cook for the soldiers. Later, she took matters into her own hands and joined the men. Her reasoning for joining was so she could make her own living and prove her independence. Martin Luther King Jr. Everyone knows his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He improvised the most iconic part. Originally, it was more a political speech rather than historical. He transformed the speech into a sermon. The original speech had no references to dreams. Lastly, interracial marriage in the United States was banned in 1664 and was not overturned until 1967. Interracial marriage was known as miscegenation. Punishment for this was enslavement, exile, or imprisonment of the white person. It went as far as trying to change the Constitution, and it was only in 2000 that Alabama was the last state to legalize it.
And here are just all of our references that we used. This is our references continued, also continued, and then the references for the photos that we used as well.